I've been an anti-war activist before I got into the media. When we were organizing protests against the Iraq War, they said, you're an agent of Saddam Hussein. When we organized protests against the war in Libya, you're an agent of Muammar Gaddafi. When you organize against the proxy war in Syria, you're an agent of Assad. So now that we're saying we don't want war with China, we don't want war with Russia, we want peace, we want dialogue, we want cooperation, they say you're an agent of Russia and you're an agent of China.
Even in South Africa, the media, as I said, is so embedded in the Western narrative. So even if you read local publications in South Africa, the narrative is 100% anti-Chinese, anti-Russia, we must defend Ukraine, oh my gosh, you know, the poor Ukrainians. These are the same people who don't care about the suffering of ordinary people on a day-to-day basis.
In the United States, we have half the country that's in or near poverty. You have tens of millions of people who are spending over half their income on rent. We have hundreds of people per year. I think it was around 900 who were killed by the police last year. It would be called a massive human rights violation if we're in any other country. We have huge spikes in gun violence, all types of problems inside the US, and yet still the US gets presented and presents itself as the exceptional nation that has the right to lecture everyone else about those very same human rights, and still presents itself as the land of milk and honey, which has the model that everyone has to follow.
America is such a violent society. It was so shocking for me the other day. I was watching this Majority Report, and they were showing a video of these kids, little league kids playing baseball, and you can hear people shooting. There's like a school shooting happening. It's the normalization of this extreme violence where in America it's almost become normal that children get shot in school, you know, that people have access to so many weapons. The whole concept of the American dream is a fantasy. If people are focusing on a war overseas, then they're not focusing on the failure of the capitalist system internally. And I do think that all of these things play into why America takes the decisions it takes and the way it behaves on the global stage when it comes to foreign policy.
Hello everybody, welcome to Talk It Out with me. I'm Li Jingjing. This show aims to show you the different voices and stories from China and the rest of the global south, especially those voices that are often neglected by the Western mainstream media. So the global south accounts for 80% of the world's population. But how come our voices are not really being presented at the world stage? Not only are our voices not really presented, all the stories are often twisted, misrepresented, especially on several Western mainstream media. My platform, my show, as you know, is one of the dozens of platforms trying to show the neglected voices and stories. And today, in this episode, I want to show you two amazing people who are doing fantastic jobs showing the neglected voices. So they're here with me in this studio. My first guest, let's start with the lady. She is Phakamile. She's the spokesperson of NAMSA, the National Union of Metalworkers in South Africa. My second guest, I'm sure a lot of viewers of my show are also the viewers of his show because he is the editor-in-chief of the Breakthrough News. I love this network. So, Ben Becker, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here.
I think this is the first time for both of you to be in China. How do you feel so far?
Time in mainland China, yes.
Love it. Loving China, loving the hospitality. It's awesome.
So we gather here today because we are for the Global South Communication Conference, International Communication Conference, because we all gather here to send a strong message, to tell the world our stories. And I think we all noticed the increasing censorship on several Western mainstream media and the social networks. So I think in this episode we can talk about the danger it has caused. For example, how about we start with you, Ben, because your platform is doing a fantastic job showing the stories from around the world, and you are doing this in the United States, which is quite impressive.
Yes, well, I mean, our whole concept is that people are hungry for different types of media. There's never been in recorded history so much distrust in the traditional legacy media, the big channels that have billions and billions of dollars, all the resources, all the technology. But after so many years of lying, so many years of distorting what's happening around the world and what's happening in the United States, people are checking out of those. People are looking for alternatives. So I think this is a great moment to actually challenge people to think a little bit more deeply about what they've learned in school, what they've learned from ABC and CNN and Fox News, think a little bit differently about the world. Even though we're in a social media era, the real thing is if we don't change the way we're looking at the world, then the social media is just going to reproduce all the same problems of the traditional media. So right now, for instance, with China and with Russia, these are now the demonized, targeted states by the US government. So if all the different media outlets repeat the same lies without ever hearing the perspectives of the people from those countries, then basically we're going to reproduce the same problem. And so look, I've been an anti-war activist before I got into the media. When we were organizing protests against the Iraq war, they said, you're an agent of Saddam Hussein. When we organized protests against the war in Libya, you're an agent of Muammar Gaddafi. When you organize against the proxy war in Syria, you're an agent of Assad. So now that we're saying we don't want war with China, we don't want war with Russia, we want peace, we want dialogue, we want cooperation, they say you're an agent of Russia and you're an agent of China. So we've heard all this before. We're unaffected by this. We're not going to be swayed by this. But unfortunately, there are real consequences in that people are being censored, people are being shadow banned. More than that, I think the biggest danger is that people then start to self-censor, because you don't actually want to speak the truth. You don't want to actually ask the questions that need to be asked because you're afraid that you too could be shut down.
It's interesting. I want to add a follow-up question because, we were all told that the United States is the freest the world, the most open society. You have the freedom of press. You can share all the views, debate, you can criticize everything. Then what you just told me sounds like different because you are trying to challenge the majority of the public of people in the United States with different ideas. So why do you have to challenge that if all the media is so free, all the expression is so free, you can discuss, debate everything in the United States?
Right. I mean, the question of free speech has to be put in its proper context. So now with social media, we all have the ability and the freedom to post something. True. Okay, so now you could say we have free speech and this seems like a freer era. But if the private social media companies control all the algorithms, have already blacklisted your accounts or have shadow banned you, and of course we don't know how that's happening, when it's happening, where it's happening, we just know that it is happening because you can look at the views and the follower counts. So what's the point of having the means to express yourself or the means to produce or publish content if you also don't have the ability to distribute it? And honestly, what's the free speech if you have 10 channels on TV all saying the same thing with slightly different tone or slightly different rhetoric, but it's basically the same consensus, then you really don't have free speech. It's basically saying you have the right to speak, but we're not going to ever give you any airtime. So for instance, there was an anti-war protest 2 months ago calling for the US to stop funding the war in Ukraine. There was like no mainstream media there in front of the White House. And I've seen this my whole life. Big anti-war protests against police violence, workers' strikes, basically not getting covered at all. In fact, we had more coverage from international media. I think CGTN was there, but I don't think the Washington Post was there or CNN was there. So, okay, that you have free speech, we had the right to protest, but then if the media is not going to cover it, in a way it nullifies or negates the exact free speech that they say they have.
And Phakamile, like we talk about the whole day about this because the reason I come to this platform is because before I always feel there's no one from us is telling our stories. It's always some Western journalist, correspondent, parachute journalist job to this country and tell our stories on our behalf in a very negative way. So I think you coming from South Africa, I'm sure you're experiencing the same thing in your country as well. So what kind of effect it has caused in your country, how dangerous it is?
Oh yes, I think we can definitely talk at length about how the traditional media space has basically lost a lot of credibility. And the reason it's lost credibility is because the majority of people, the working class, are suddenly seeing that actually I'm not represented here on this platform. These people are speaking about me, they're speaking for me, but they're not speaking about things that I care about. They're not driving policies or implementing agendas that represent what I want. And the reality is that I, for example, am a spokesperson for the largest trade union in South Africa, which is the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa. And we have the same challenge in South Africa. The media space is suffocatingly small. It's owned by a few people with lots of money. It's very corporatized. Yes, we've got a public broadcaster that broadcasts to more than 30 million people in the country. But even that public broadcaster has been heavily influenced by the neoliberal right-wing narrative that's very dominant in Western media. So the perspective of ordinary workers and their families and the daily struggles that they have are never presented in a way that truly reflects who they are. They are workers in South Africa in mainstream media, especially when they are expressing their rights, whether they are picketing or protesting or they go on a strike. They are demonized. They are labeled as if they are attacking the economy. You know, there's all kinds of negativity that they're branded with. But there's never any critique, analysis, or criticism of the capitalist system that created the conditions that makes the working class to react in the way that they do. There's a lot of violence that how capitalism expresses itself is very violent. But the media never shows that. Workers, ordinary people who sort of reject the system are always portrayed as if they are the problem. And that's because the ultimate problem that we have in this space is that as long as we've got a media that is controlled by corporate interests, you're never going to get the truth. You're going to get what the corporation wants the masses to believe. Now, that's not the truth. That's propaganda. And so for us, this is a huge frustration, and this is why being part of this conference is such a great opportunity, because it presents us with opportunities to connect with other platforms. I'm so happy I got to meet Ben in person.
Likewise.
Because I've actually been engaging with members of his team on some of our issues that we've been highlighting. We've been fighting against this just energy transition, which is not just, has been hijacked by capital. And you guys did a great work in unpacking the struggles that are affecting ordinary workers as we transition from from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So that's when I realized, especially in my work, that we really need to do a lot more to consolidate these spaces and these platforms, to strengthen them, so that we are the majority. So why shouldn't we dominate in the media space? Why must we always be on the fringes? We're not on the fringes. We speak for the majority. So it's literally about us taking our place in society, claiming it and saying, actually, we're no longer interested in begging from you. We actually are going to do things on our own terms. And that's what I like about what this conference is doing for us.
I remember when the Ukraine crisis took place, and a lot of the West, suddenly they were shocked. Why people in Africa is not sanctioning Russia? I mean, and then the same with China. See, China is not sanctioning Russia, then China is with Russia for this conflict, and then they think all the Chinese people are brainwashed. I noticed they also try to brainwash Chinese people on this subject through their embassy's account on Weibo. And they have their ministers, ambassadors try to send the narratives, the Western narratives. They totally just backlash in the comment section, because Chinese people apparently know the history. And when the British ambassador commented trying to lecture Chinese people, the territorial integrity and blah, 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 all the Chinese netizens are just saying, okay, give the Falkland back to Argentina before lecturing us. So, I mean, it's hilarious when they suddenly realize, oh, people in China and Africa, which combined has almost 3 billion people together, have a different opinion.
We can think, oh my gosh, what a surprise. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even in South Africa, the media, as I said, is so embedded in the Western narrative. So even if you read local publications in South Africa, the narrative is 100% anti-Chinese, anti-Russia. We must defend Ukraine. Oh my gosh, the poor Ukrainians. These are the same people who don't care about the suffering of ordinary people on a day-to-day basis. There's members of the working class that die every day in South Africa from hunger, from poverty, from unemployment. We've got the highest levels of unemployment, I think, in the world now, or certainly one of the highest on the continent, higher than the Ukraine, which is at war. We're the most unequal society in the world. The same people who are busy preaching to us about defending Ukraine don't talk about those things. And so when media houses started to push this narrative that the South African government is wrong for being neutral on this question, as I'm sure you know, that the UN debated this and South Africa took a position to stay neutral and to abstain in the vote. They've been highly, highly criticized. The backlash, if you look at social media on Twitter, you'll see ordinary people fighting back to say, but no. Why should we defend NATO? Because this is actually a NATO war. This is about Western Europe replaying the Cold War all over again, basically. This is about them trying to claw back hegemony, trying to become powerful again. And the experience that African people have with Russia and China is not the same as what has been presented in the media. I mean, historically speaking, why should Russia be our enemy? When under apartheid, it was the Russians, the Soviets, who were helping to arm members of the liberation movement, who were helping to educate members of the liberation movement overseas. So why should Putin be our enemy? Why should we get involved in this? And we have been victims of this kind of interference all the time. So really, I think you're absolutely right, Ben, when you say that at this point in history, there's never been a time when there's been this serious pushback against these traditional forms of media, because people are sick and tired of being spoken to as if they're represented when they're not. And you can only fool people for so long. And this is where we are, I think, in the media space, where people are trying to say, look, we want to see more of what speaks about us. We want to be represented properly. We want to hear other views before we take a decision or take a position on certain things.
I think you both mentioned how the voices of the working class are basically ignored, oppressed in South Africa, in the United States as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the United States, we have half the country that's in or near poverty. You have tens of millions of people who are spending over half their income on rent. We have hundreds of people per year. I think it was around 900 who were killed by the police last year. Massive human right. It would be called a massive human rights violation if we're in any other country. We have huge spikes in gun violence, all types of problems inside the US. And yet still the US gets presented and presents itself as the exceptional nation that has the right to lecture everyone else about those very same human rights, and still presents itself as the land of milk and honey, which has the model that everyone has to follow. So I actually think these two things are related. You know, their erasure of what's happening inside the United States is also what helps them present this kind of narrative to the rest of the world. And to the extent we can show the other America, the other United States, this helps people around the global South also answer those narratives in their own countries.
Are you worried your network going to be censored, banned, or erased from the platforms?
Look, we're not connected to any state media. I think they would like to censor us if they could find a good justification. Of course, because they're private companies, they almost don't even need a justification. They can just do it and whatever. I mean, they can basically just dare you to challenge them. So yeah, we are always worried about that. That's why we have to be operating on many different platforms so that our followers can jump to the next platform if that were to happen. But so far, look, we have a commitment to the truth. We have a commitment to facts. We believe we have the right to interview people from China. We have the right to interview people from South Africa or from Russia or from everywhere else. So, you know, we feel that we're on the right side of history, and we don't feel afraid about the fear of censorship. If you go back to the 1950, after the Chinese Revolution, you know, these things have always been related. The first McCarthyite attacks, after the Chinese Revolution, the US said, who lost China? Who lost China? And they're going to start censoring and attacking anyone who stood for peace with China and the Soviet Union. And that kind of narrative is not just bad for the media, it's bad for everyone, because that's a narrative that ultimately leads to war. That led to the Korean War. They were prepared to send nuclear weapons to China in 1950, 1951. And right now, look what they're doing. They're preparing for major power conflict with Russia, with China, or maybe with both. So this kind of ideological preparation where they censor or try to shadow ban or delegitimize the voices for peace can only be understood as part of the path to war. So that's also a working class issue, because who is it that would die in a nuclear war or a major power conflict? It's going to be the working class also. So these are the issues we have to connect. I actually have some confidence, even though people are kind of being brainwashed by the anti-China frenzy, the anti-Russian narrative. I don't think people actually want war. They actually do want peace in general. And I think that we have a lot in common with the people of the world. Everyone's talking about artificial intelligence, climate change, all these sort of common problems. They can't be solved with the major powers of the world being at war. And I think at a very basic level, when you're able to communicate with people directly and remind them of that, they agree. Even if they've been sort of bought off by this or that piece of propaganda, I think at their base, they don't want war.
Speaking of war, I feel the authorities in the United States is really facilitating the process of going to war with China over Taiwan. So we keep hearing the officials saying we're going to go to war with China in 2025 or in 2027. They have a specific year, even though China never say anything about the dates of a war, and they always prioritize a reunification, peaceful reunification with between mainland and Taiwan. And then, so why you keep announcing, giving everybody a date? So this is preparing the public, right? Like we're gonna go to war, be prepared. We're gonna go to war, be prepared. China's doing this, they're so aggressive. We're gonna go to war to defend the democracy in the Pacific, 8,300 miles away from US borders. I think this is, from what I read from the headlines, I feel it's very dangerous because I feel like the government is preparing a war probably 3 or 4 years later. But do you feel this is like very urgent, very dangerous?
Yes, it's very urgent, very dangerous, and it's very insane. I mean, the idea that they're going to wage some kind of war over Taiwan. I don't think people in the US will sign up for that. I think the idea that it could be somehow a limited conflict is also a fantasy, and a very dangerous fantasy, because once you start that war, things can escalate very quickly. It's also disrupting, of course, the very foundation of US-China relations in the Shanghai Communique, which was to recognize Taiwan as part of China, with one China policy. So it's really destabilizing the foundation of the most important relationship in world politics, and doing so in such sort of a nonchalant way that we might just go to war. I do think that in general, what the US wants to do is increase the pressure on China. Their view about the Ukraine war is that it's a good war. Even though they cry the crocodile tears, they think the Ukraine war is good because it's bleeding Russia, and they think going to increase the sort of international isolation of Russia, increase the pressure on Russia, make it hard economically on Russia. Their view about how they overthrew the Soviet Union was they got the Soviet Union to spend all of their resources on basically military defense, and increased the pressure until the Soviet Union internally collapsed. So I think their real view is not just about they're eager to go to war, although I do think some of them are eager, but the deeper strategy is they're hoping that there can be a change of government, regime change in China. And Taiwan, they think, is the issue to force regime change. I also think that's a fantasy, and a very dangerous fantasy. The people of China are not going to tolerate that. And so that then becomes the logic of escalation. And again, I don't think the people in the US can basically even identify where Taiwan is on a map. Just being honest about where people's geographic skills are, they're definitely not going to want to go to war with the largest country and the largest military over an island they can't identify on a map. But obviously the generals in the Pentagon, the foreign policy establishment, they're not willing to let the unipolar world just go quietly into the night. And so they are willing to risk even the most horrific kind of wars, or at least to try to get us all the way to that line, if they think that can be the way to preserve unipolar US domination. That's what we're up against. That's why our task is so urgent, to really spread alternative news. It's not because we want to become influencers or build a following or make a little bit of money, not at all. We're actually trying to have an impact on the course of events and on the course of history.
If I can just add to what Ben has said, we must not take away from the fact that we're dealing here with an America that is 100% rabidly capitalist. There are real financial benefits to going to war. And not too long ago, they pulled out of Afghanistan. So, the military-industrial complex is a structure that is really integral to America. Its very foundations in terms of the kind of financial resources that it brings in. So to heighten that fear-mongering means that we must spend more. We must spend more on weapons. We must spend more in the army. And obviously that feeds the military-industrial complex. And so that is also, I think, one of the motivators for this. And we know this about America because that's kind of how they've operated in terms of the way they interact with other countries globally. They're warmongers, They don't want peace.
Think about the insanity of what you just said, though. They thought they were going to fight a limited war against Afghanistan. Small little Afghanistan. Took 20 years against the Taliban, and they still lost. And now they think they're going to fight wars against Russia and China.
Yeah. Well,
you see the absurdity of what we're dealing with, and yet this has been presented so much and so often to the people of the United States that they're trying to get us to normalize this concept of a war with Russia and China. Whereas 5 years ago, you would have been obviously saying, no, we can never go to war with these countries. They're too big, they're too powerful, too destructive. But now if you say we should not go to war with those countries, now you're the crazy one. See, this is how they've changed sort of what is common sense in just a few years, just through an onslaught of nonstop propaganda.
And by the way, isn't war a great distraction for the public for domestic problems? I mean, America is such a violent society. It was so shocking for me the other day. I was watching this Majority report, and they were showing a video of these kids, little league kids playing baseball. And you can hear people shooting. There's like a school shooting happening. It's the normalization of this extreme violence where in America it's almost become normal that children get shot in school, you know, that people have access to so many weapons. They're so highly weaponized. So as long as you are trying to deflect attention from your domestic problems by focusing on the Ukraine, China, you know, demonizing other nations without you having to deal internally with your crisis. I mean, capitalism is in crisis in America. There's high levels of homelessness and poverty, and people don't have access to decent healthcare. So the whole concept of the American dream is a fantasy. If people are focusing on a war overseas, then they're not focusing on the failure of the capitalist system internally. And I do think that all of these things play into why America takes the decisions it takes and the way it behaves on the global stage when it comes to foreign policy.
That reminds me, several years ago while I was traveling to New York, I was just walking around in the city with my landlords of the Airbnb. So we were just traveling, walking in the Times Squares. We are taking a photo. So I want to put my backpack on the ground because it doesn't look good in the photo. I put it, and she was like, no, don't put it there. I was like, why? Oh, no, I don't mind my backpack getting dirty, just some dust. So, no, it's not about getting dirty. People will think it's a bomb. I was like, huh? It would, because to me that was crazy. It will never be the first thing that pops up in my mind when I see a bag or unattended bag or luggage. So at that moment, I was so shocked. People so get used to gun violence, bombing. It would never happen in China. And as a woman, I can walk freely 3 a.m. in the streets. I don't need to worry about a thing. I don't need to worry about being robbed, a gunshot. So, I mean, that difference of mentality was a really cultural shock to me back to those years. But I think probably just getting worse and worse these years. And especially this anti-China threat among us is just making more Asian Americans becoming the victims of the hate.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's a very long history in the United States where the foreign enemy also becomes the domestic enemy. And it leads to racism, it leads to mob violence. There's a long history right after 9/11 with the Iraq War, all the attacks on Muslim and South Asian communities. This story has almost been forgotten now in mainstream media, but thousands of people were subjected to different types of violence in the weeks and the months of those period. People were rounded up, sent to prison, sent to detention centers. So in a way, this has now turned to the Asian American community, and it's horrible. There's a big movement against Asian hate, and I think the best elements of that movement are also uniting with the movement against racism, racist police violence against black people. There's racism towards Latino immigrants, which is very severe right now, that both Biden and Trump are doing basically the same types of policies to demonize and vilify migrants. So, you know, in all this sort of suffering, there's also the basis for a type of unity that has to be built. You know, this conference this weekend is about Global South unity, which is understandable. Asia, Africa, Latin America. But there's also the internally oppressed peoples inside the United States who historically can look to the rest of the world and have looked to the rest of the world when they're thinking about what does social justice look like? What do human rights actually look like? The right to walk the streets safely, is that not a human right? The right to healthcare, is that not a human right? You know, the right to be able to speak your own language and not fear persecution. Those are all rights. So I think that, you know, in the history of the 1960s, the 1970s, when there were big movements against racism and against different forms of social injustice, a lot of the young people in that period were talking about what is happening in Vietnam, what is happening in China, what is happening in Cuba. They were actually situating themselves as part of a global community. I think that could happen again in the United States, precisely because there's so much injustice and there's so much oppression that people ultimately start to look for who are our allies. And so ironically, this is the thing that all this oppression and scapegoating could produce. It could produce its opposite. It could produce solidarity on the other side.
Yeah. I agree with that, because even from the space I operate in, we actually do a lot of solidarity work where we have relationships with trade unions, not just in South Africa, but in the region, on the continent, and all over the globe. And we actually have relationships with some of your trade unions in America. And I think this issue of solidarity is going to become more and more important, especially when you talk about uniting the working class. Because at the end of the day, there's many commonalities in terms of our struggles and the cause of our suffering. The same things that are affecting poor people in South Africa, unemployment, poverty, inequality, are the same things that are affecting Americans, you know? And I think so when you're faced with this kind of vicious, violent attack from a brutal imperialist capitalist state, the logical response should be that the working class should unite across borders, so that solidarity language and that amplification of that voice can be enhanced. South Africa has got experience in that, because, as you know, when we were under apartheid, we would not have been able to end the apartheid system if there hadn't been a global movement of solidarity. There were many countries outside of South Africa that were assisting us, where you had progressive organizations that were involved. Cuba came all the way to fight in a war on the continent, to defend and free Black people on the continent. So those kinds of things are going to become more and more important. The working class needs to see that we are more the same than we are different because of this animal that we're all facing. And if we can all sort of unite around a common agenda, we can actually achieve a lot of things.
That's one of the things I probably answered my next question, is how can we make our voices of the working class, whichever country you're from, voices from the working class, voices from the global south being heard? Because especially now we are in a very hostile platforms. How can we make our voice heard? How can we defend ourselves? Last question, your guys' thoughts?
I think it's a good question. In a way, it's the hardest question of all, because the problem is the flows of information, both the hardware, the software, the social media platforms are almost all controlled by Western companies outside of China. China has its own social media companies, good for it, but the rest of the world doesn't. And so, this leaves us really vulnerable, susceptible to the different types of shadow bans. It makes it very hard to amplify the voices that we want to amplify. There's a great need to develop alternative distribution networks. The right wing and the far right is already starting to do this. Some people might actually be deceived in thinking that is the alternative media or that's the answer to the traditional media. I don't think so. I think it's actually moving in it's also going to be anti-China. It's also going to be imperialistic. It's also going to be anti-immigrant, anti-women. These platforms are not the answer to the traditional platforms. So in a way, there's still a big gap, and we need something new. And then in terms of our work where we are still existing on these platforms, I think we have to really create our own kind of echo chamber. We don't want to be a echo chamber that's insulated, where we're not being able to speak popularly and persuasively to those who aren't in it. We always want to bring people in, but we need to build our own kind of community, our own base of support, where if there's a good guest on one platform, they should go on all the different platforms. We should become the household names. In a way, I don't even think we should think of ourselves as alternative media, because that already gives away that the main media is the Western media. And what all these social media tools allow us to become is to be our own media. We want to be the primary reference point for people. We don't want to be a secondary or third reference point where they get all their propaganda first and then they go and maybe want to hear something alternative, the other point of view. No, we want to be the reliable sources first and foremost that they turn to. I think the fact that we are talking about the global south, that is the vast majority of the people, why shouldn't that be your first reference point? Why should your first reference point be BBC, CNN, their time has passed. So we have to be explicit in saying that their time has passed. In a way, we have to refocus our people's energies and their attention on the platforms that we already trust.
Very well said.
I think what Ben has said is absolutely true. This whole notion of alternative media sort of diminishes who we are in terms of who we represent. We represent the majority of people. We've always been the voices of the masses. What we've normalized is the domination of the elite, where the elite present their ideas as if they are the ideas of the masses. So really, it's about undoing all of that. And I think the very fact that you even have so many people sort of gravitating towards some of these right-wing platforms, I think it's a reflection of the genuine hunger that's out there for what we're presenting. People are looking for this message of the working class, this message that presents working people as powerful, as agents of change, as people who can transform their societies and transform their lives. They've not been empowered in that way. They've been fed all this propaganda by Western media, which disempowers them, which empowers and enriches only the elite. So whenever we speak, there's always a lot of response. And I think you've seen that in the growth of your network and the interest that people have. And it's because people are genuinely hungry for the truth. Corporate media is not giving them the truth, because as long as you have to pay for it, as long as it's controlled to benefit somebody economically, is it really the truth? Is it not really about you telling me what I want to hear because I've been paid to do it? You know, Karl Marx is the one who spoke about media being free. The true concept of a free media means it's free. It means it's freely accessible. I'm not paying for it. And I'm not going to suffer, you know, as a result of it. I just get the truth. I get the information when I need it. There's an opportunity for us to occupy that space, given how damaging corporate media has been, how much they've commercialized this concept of free press and abused it for their own selfish gain, for us to rewrite the script and to remind ourselves that actually the power belongs to us, doesn't belong to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. Really enjoyed this conversation with you too. I hope you guys can come to my show more often, and I hope
we hope so too.
I hope you will have a wonderful time in China.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.